In Colombia, on the 38th day of protests, the National Strike Committee has reiterated its willingness to engage in substantial talks with the government. Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the completion of pipe laying for the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline to Germany. China has condemned the United States for abusing the concept of national security and blacklisting Chinese companies. From the headquarters of teleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South, and I'm Katrina Goss. In Colombia, after 38 days of protest, the National Strike Committee once again reiterated its willingness to engage in substantial talks with the government. The committee held President Ivan Duque's government responsible for the slow progress in the talks, aimed at creating a sustainable scenario for substantial negotiations on the country's future. According to the Strike Committee, agreement has been reached on half of the issues on the proposed agenda, while on 9 major discrepancies remain. Non-involvement of military forces in controlling protests, the autonomy of local governments to manage demonstrations, a ban on the use of firearms against protesters, protocols for the mobile anti-riot squadron, and the mechanism for following up on the agreement are among the main points in dispute. Staying in Colombia, President Ivan Duque's police continue the unrelentless violent repression of protests. Transportation facilities are reportedly being used as provisional detention centres. According to the alternative media outlet Colombia Informa, in several sectors of Bogotá, the Colombian capital, the mobile anti-riot squad attacked demonstrators and detained them in bus stations. In the vicinity of Portal Suba, one of the main stations of the Transmilenio mass transit system of Bogotá, police harassed journalists and human rights defenders who were gathered around the site. This week, the Transmilenio company confirmed the allegations. 4 protesters were detained at Portal Suba on May 19th, while 10 others, including a woman, were detained at Portal Americas between May 3rd and 4th, a statement from the company said. As the protests continue, more than 400 COVID-19 deaths were reported in the last 24 hours in Colombia. Meanwhile, the Pan American Health Organization confirmed that the country registers the highest daily rate of infection in South America. Since the beginning of the pandemic, Colombia has registered more than 3.4 million cases of COVID-19 and over 90,000 deaths. Almost 30,000 new infections were diagnosed on Thursday as the nation faces a deep social and political crisis. According to the Pan American Health Organization, Colombia showed the most lethal numbers since March 6, 2020, when the first case of COVID-19 was recorded. Despite the data, the government unilaterally opened its borders this week, prompting protests from Panama and Venezuela. In Chile, a few days before the body that will draft the new constitution is formed, the results of the platform entitled We Have to Talk About Chile were announced, in which more than 100,000 citizens participated with ideas and proposals for the members of the Constitutional Convention. More details with our correspondent Paula Drabnik.
These are some of the faces in those in Chile whose mission is to write a new constitution. This is the first time that almost all of them have come together. They are 101 of the 155 elected by the people of Chile for this task.
You will be the voices, as you know very well, of a population that has long felt marginalized from any relevant decision-making, and what is expected from you is precisely that you will be making decisions on issues that are crucial to citizens.
They were invited by the University of Chile and the Catholic University so that they could find out the results of the public debates that this institution carried out during 2020 under the platform We Have to Talk About Chile.
That they really work for the benefit of the country as a whole. That they understand the dialogue and understand all the points, otherwise the new constitution will be of no use, because everything that we have done will be of no use.
8,000 inhabitants of the 346 communes of the country participated, who, through video calls and without knowing each other, discussed what to change, maintain and improve in Chile. Another 95,000 did so through digital consultations. This is the most important citizen participation exercise carried out in the country, and today it seeks to become a source of information to support the future Constitutional Convention members.
We have to assume this feeling of certainty and give assurances. And I believe that the first responsibility we have the rules to have clear rule.
In Chile, citizens have never written a constitution. Everyone is seeking strategies, advice and support. That is why this initiative not only delivers results, but also offers techniques to get closer to citizens.
To ask you if you would be available to work, essentially to guide the territorial teams of the Constitutional Convention to develop in-depth work in relation to the participation in our efforts.
As part of the challenge of including as many people as possible, more than 50 civil society organizations and 27 other universities in the country supported the debates, which include remote and rural areas and persons deprived of their liberty.
This is not going to be a success if it is seen that the constituent process is limited to a group of people elected at the ballot box, who lock themselves up in Santiago in a palace and come out after a year with a text that is proposed to citizens to approve or reject. There must be participation.
Improving public sector ethics, valuing diversity, the perception of a state and political system that does not care about the needs of the people are some of the 10 conclusions that emerged from the We Need to Talk About Chile project.
I came from the second region of the city of Calama at 2,200 meters altitude, the only highline city of this country, a zone of sacrifice, an area saturated by contamination.
How will these concerns be addressed in the new constitution? It would depend on these elected figures, but also on citizen vigilance.
Italo Retamal y Paola Dragnik, teleSUR, Chile.
And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. An Australian court this week heard a case calling for the declassification of intelligence archives about the role played by Australia in overthrowing the Chilean Democratic Socialist government of President Salvador Allende in 1973. The court order is being sought by a former Australian intelligence agent, Clinton Fernandez, who believes the country helped in overthrowing Allende and imposing a bloody dictatorship. Most of the case was heard behind closed doors after the Australian government said some issues could put the country's security at risk. But Fernandez's lawyer refuted this during his brief public appearance on Thursday, arguing that not all the documents, which span the late 1960s through the mid-1970s, put Australian security at risk. For a long time, it was believed that the military coup of General Augusto Pinochet was imposed on Chile solely on orders from then United States President Richard Nixon on behalf of transnational corporations. But later reports also implicated the United Kingdom and now Australia. Allende's government lasted only 3 years, in which it nationalised the country's resources and strategic enterprises and implemented a wide agrarian reform. And to discuss the evidence of Australian involvement in the coup against Chile's Allende government, we now welcome Dr. Rodrigo Acuna, an expert on Latin American politics and the host of Alborada's Indestructible podcast, who joins us from Sydney. Dr. Acuna, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Rodrigo, an Australian tribunal heard the case on whether to declassify documents regarding the role of Australian intelligence in the 1973 coup this week. What can you tell us about the revelations and the case for declassification?
Well, I can't tell you much in terms of the developments within the court because the Australian Attorney General, Michaela Cash, has imposed quite tight restrictions in terms of how or the access that the media can have to the court's proceedings. So basically, we heard the opening arguments, and then the court was basically, the media was shut out of the court proceedings. The background to the story is basically that it is well known here in Australia that in 1973 there were two ACES, that's the Australian Intelligence Organisation. Two Australian ACES agents were in Chile just prior to and during the coup d'etat against President Salvador Allende. The two agents were actually requested by the Australian Prime Minister at the time, who was the progressive Australian Prime Minister Govt, to be recalled back to Australia. And those orders were actually defied, and that actually didn't take place. So many people here in Australia have been attempting to discover what these two agents were doing in Chile and what their actual role was. Now, the Australian Intelligence Organisation and the Australian government has always refused to provide details until recently a former intelligence agent and a current university professor, Clinton Fernandez, actually commenced legal proceedings against the Australian government in an attempt to discover what these two agents were doing in Chile.
Rodrigo, following this week's hearings, mainly being held behind closed doors, the tribunal's reserved its ruling for a later date. Do you think we can expect anything to come of this case, or could a ruling be indefinitely delayed?
I honestly don't know. I think that the Australian government it's very difficult for the Australian government to argue that it is a matter of national security. The Cold War, of course, is over. The CIA itself, who was a key protagonist during the coup d'etat against Allende, has revealed enormous amounts of archives in terms of their role in Chile in 1973. So for the Australian Intelligence Organisation to argue that it is a matter of national security is a little bit difficult to believe.
Rodrigo, this is not the only case pending a decision by an Australian court linked to the coup and the Pinochet dictatorship, is it?
Correct. The former intelligence agent Adriana Rivas, who was herself the personal secretary of Manuel Contreras, who was the head of Chilean intelligence during the first few years of the military dictatorship by Augusto Pinochet, she herself was discovered a few years ago to be living here in Sydney, in Bondi, passing herself off as a nanny. Now, she actually fled Chile a few years ago because she had been arrested, and legal proceedings against her were about to commence regarding the disappearance of numerous opposition members against the Chilean dictatorship. Now, she was eventually arrested because of a mass campaign that members of the Chilean community commenced for that to actually occur, for the Australian government to actually honour its extradition agreement with Chile. There is an extradition agreement between the two countries. She was eventually arrested, but she has continued to appeal the decision, which eventually did go against her, for her to be extradited to Chile. And it looks like now she has reached the limits of those appeals. So it appears that within the next month or so, we may well hear a final decision in terms of her extradition. And many members of the Chilean community are optimistic that she will be extradited to Santiago to face criminal charges for the execution and possible disappearance of several members of the opposition to the Pinochet military regime.
Dr. Rodrigo Acuna, expert on Latin American politics and the host of Alvarada's Indestructible podcast, thank you so much for joining us today and for offering your insight into these revelations on Australia's role in the 1973 coup against Chilean President Salvador Allende. Thank you.
Thank you.
This Friday, Russian President Vladimir Putin delivered a speech at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. The annual event is the country's main showcase for investors and brings together thousands of business representatives and political leaders from around the world. Putin announced the completion of pipe laying for the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline to Germany. The United States has thoroughly opposed the pipeline, even sanctioning companies for participating in it.
People from different countries, including businessmen, heads of big European companies and other companies, visit Russia specifically with a purpose to vaccinate against the coronavirus. In this regard, I asked the government to analyze all the aspects of this issue until the end of the month, so that to organize the conditions for paid vaccination for foreign citizens in our country in correspondence with the safety precautions and sanitary control. 2.5 hours ago, the laying of the pipes of the first gas pipeline Nord Stream 2 was finished. The construction works of the second gas pipeline continues. The line work, including the offshore section, was finished. What is left is that there is a pipe that came from the German side and a pipe from the Russian side. They needed to be lifted and welded. That's it. But the pipeline was finished.
The Russian president also demanded that his country act more decisively in curbing greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, Putin praised his country's comprehensive coronavirus vaccination effort.
In the next 30 years, the accumulated volume of net greenhouse gas emissions should be lower than in Europe. I believe it's an ambitious task, but it can be solved. I call on the government to develop a detailed plan of action. Today, every citizen of Russia has the opportunity to be vaccinated. It is comfortable as possible, voluntary and free of charge. I'd like to ask our citizens to take this opportunity and protect themselves and their loved ones. The Russian vaccine has been recognized as the safest and most effective. Efficiency is over 96%, and according to our regulatory agencies, there have been no fatalities from the use of Sputnik V and others.
And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin blasted the United States for abusing the concept of national security and blacklisting Chinese companies.
The US government has generalized the concept of national security and abused state power to suppress and constrain Chinese companies by any possible means. China firmly opposes this. The US Act violates market principles, disrupts market rules and order, and harms the legitimate rights and interests of both Chinese enterprises and the investors from other countries, including the United States. China urges the US to respect market rules and principles, drop all kinds of so-called lists that suppress Chinese enterprises, and provide them with a fair, just, and non-discriminatory business environment. The Chinese government will take necessary measures to safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese companies.
The finance ministers of the Group of 7 capitalist economies met in England ahead of the G7 summit next week. The meeting was hosted by British Finance Minister Rishi Sunak with his counterparts from Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan and the United States. The ministers agreed on committing economic stimulus for as long as necessary to make up for the economic slowdown sparked by the coronavirus. Climate change and social inequalities were also discussed, as well as the regulation of digital currencies such as Bitcoin. The Group of 7 leaders will gather in southwest England on June 11th, with the US President Joe Biden attending on his first foreign tour since taking office in January. Meanwhile, the G7 health ministers continued a 2-day discussion addressing issues such as sharing vaccines with developing countries, responding to global outcries for fairer distribution of jabs. The bloc is divided on demands for the temporary waiver of vaccine patents to enhance access to immunisation, with transnational pharmaceuticals strongly opposing it. The meeting also focused on improving identification of animal-borne infections, as it's estimated that 3/5 of all infections jump from animals to humans through the human intervention in nature. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro criticised the United States for excluding his country from a vaccine donation program for developing countries.
Hamas Story has just declared that Joe Biden's government is going to donate vaccines to the world, but that they are not going to donate vaccines to Venezuela. They hate us, they think of us negatively, they are miserable. Hamas Story, you are miserable people who hate and despise Venezuela because we are rebels. We are Bolivarian and we are going to continue being so, and Venezuela is going to have all your vaccines.
Cuban authorities announced Friday a massive vaccination campaign in Havana, where the rate of coronavirus contagion is most acute. The domestically developed jab Abdala is already being applied to groups and neighbourhoods most at risk. The aim is to achieve the full 3-dose immunisation for the entire population of Cuba's capital by the end of July, the Minister of Public Health, José Ángel Porter Miranda, explained. According to the plan, all Havana residents will get at least 1 shot of Abdala by late June. Cuba has developed 5 COVID-19 vaccine candidates, despite the severe limitations it faces due to the US blockade. Health authorities in India claim the country is on its way to recovery from the devastating second wave of COVID-19 infections. According to government officials, weekly cases have fallen 63% from the peak in early May. However, restrictions have continued to be imposed in many parts of the country, including New Delhi, where most shops and marketplaces have remained closed for more than a month. The Health Ministry warned the battle against the virus was not over and people must continue to follow appropriate behaviour. A member of the National Institution for Transforming India think tank said the country had now overtaken the United States in terms of the total number of people who've received a first dose of a COVID-19 vaccine.
We have overtaken US in terms of number of people who have received at least a single dose of COVID-19 vaccine. I repeat, we have overtaken US in terms of number of people in our country who have received at least one dose of vaccine.
This is a long-drawn battle. It is not going to end soon. So, since this is a long-drawn battle, we need to keep at it with the same determination and momentum, which means we need to continue proper COVID-appropriate behavior.
And we've come to the end of this news brief. Remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also follow us on social media for all the latest news. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram. And you can catch up on our shows on our YouTube channel. For teleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss. Thank you for watching.